Beginning in the mid-1800s, Asian immigrants began to come to America in greater waves than they had in previous eras. These immigrants from Asia came to America for many of the same reasons European immigrants did: for greater and political religious rights and to escape economic hardships. Throughout their history, Asian Americans have confronted a longer legacy of exclusion and inequity in comparison to other immigrant groups, especially during periods of changing demographics, economic recession, or during times of war. Despite the vast historic, cultural, and linguistic differences, distinct Asian nationalities within the United States have been grouped together and treated similarly in school policies, under immigration legislation, and within the larger scope of American society as a whole. America was traditionally a haven for all immigrants looking for a better or new life. Early on in our nation's history, we had open gates and welcomed immigrants to help us grow and expand. However, as immigration numbers increased and there was a notable shift in the countries that were sending immigrants to the United States, many Americans wanted to curb or begin to limit the number of immigrants that we allowed into the country. In our country, we began to see the rise of Nativism, which is the fear of incoming cultures and a desire to protect what are thought of as American culture and values. This is a policy of promoting the interests and cultures of the native inhabitants against those of incoming immigrants. Nativist policies would include supporting immigration restrictions and other pieces of legislation that would lead to segregation, and nativism oftentimes would erupt in violence. The older immigrants and cultures that had been in America and in the United States for generations, Americans of British, German, French, and Scandinavian descent, did not like the addition of new immigrants, the addition of the Asians, the Russians, Eastern Europeans, and Italian immigrants. It was very unsettling to many of these Americans. In a sense, it was quite hypocritical that Americans would try to limit immigration, because many of them were formerly poor immigrants who had come to the United States, escaping the same types of hardships as new immigrants. In this cartoon, titled Looking Backward, you can see European immigrants being blocked by wealthy Americans. But if you look at the shadows projected on the wall, you can see that these wealthy men came from humble beginnings. These men had escaped economic hardships and achieved the American dream, yet they're preventing others from doing the same. As we move forward, remember that European immigrants during previous times were welcomed with open arms, and while there was some processing done at Ellis Island starting in the 1890s, there were no real restrictions in European immigration, other than being healthy and getting through your Ellis Island interviews. While Europeans were free to come in groups and droves in the country, some European groups, however, still faced nativist backlash as they came into the United States. In this cartoon, European immigrants, many of whom are Italians, are being represented as rats flooding our shores. Some of them with things like mafia, anarchists, and socialists written on their hats and bandanas. Nativists would often use individuals' political beliefs and ideologies as reasons for them being undesirable additions to American society. Economic conditions and job competition had a lot to do with the rise of nativism. Because they were quick to take some low-paying jobs, and they came in large numbers, the Irish were targets of some nativist Americans. Some Americans did not like the addition of groups like the Irish that were escaping tough economic times and were oftentimes willing to take jobs at lower wages than other American workers. The Irish, like many Asian immigrants, were responsible for being a cheap source of labor for large projects like constructing the railroads. Asian Americans would face the same backlash as economic conditions worsened and there became a greater competition for jobs in the United States. This cartoon shows you how the Irish and Chinese were both victims of the same type of nativist ideology of the times. But the cartoon, like the government policies of the time, is harsher and more biased against the Chinese. You can see there is an Irish and Asian immigrant swallowing Uncle Sam. Between them, trains stretched across the landscape, which, when they were being built, the immigrant groups, the Asians and the Irish, were the main sources of the cheap labor. As the cartoon progresses in stages, eventually after they finish Uncle Sam, the Chinese immigrant swallows the Irish immigrant too. The artist portrays the Chinese as being the bigger threat to American society. While Irish and Chinese immigrants face some of the same forms of nativism in the United States, Asian immigrants as a whole would face greater levels of nativist backlash that would be hurled at them, which included immigration restrictionist policies, segregation laws, and violence as we turn towards the 20th century that European immigrant groups did not see. Beginning in the 1850s, young single men were recruited as contract laborers from southern China, and after the Civil War, the Burlingame Treaty between the United States and China further increased the numbers of Chinese immigrants coming to America. Fleeing poverty and upheaval in China, they, like European immigrants, filled low-paying jobs in the American economy. Working as miners, railroad builders, farmers, factory workers, and fishermen, the Chinese began to populate the states on the West Coast and became an important part of the economies of Western states. For instance, Chinese workers in California represented 20% of California's labor force by 1870, even though they constituted less than 1/100% of the entire U.S. population. The California Gold Rush and the building of the railroads were responsible for helping increase the number of Chinese immigrants to the United States. These immigrants that came to the United States were employed in the most dangerous and backbreaking jobs. Many of the jobs available to the Chinese immigrants while working in the mines or with the railroads were more dangerous than the ones available to their white counterparts. They were oftentimes the jobs that involved explosives, and Chinese workers were not fairly compensated in comparison to others while working in the mines or with the railroads. They worked side by side with white workers, but for far less pay. While Chinese workers were not paid equally in comparison to white workers, their economic conditions and chance for economic advancement here in the United States was usually better than in their homelands. Early Chinese immigrants often wrote home about the gold mountains in the United States and better economic opportunities, and immigrants in China who were thinking about leaving kept hearing about prosperity and riches here, and which led to more Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. Chinese labor was supported by many industries and the government until there was an economic downturn in 1876 that led to a depression in 1877. Amidst white workers and their cries of, "They're taking away our jobs," and that the Chinese must go, a push for anti-Chinese legislation began to take hold here in the United States. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the only United States law to prevent immigration and naturalization based on race. It restricted Chinese immigration to the United States for the next 60 years. The act banned all unskilled laborers from immigrating from China, but it allowed for some exemptions, and it did allow merchants, clergy, diplomats, teachers, and students still into the country. The anti-Chinese movement was so strong that after the act, Chinese immigration to the United States declined from 39,500 in 1882 to only 10 immigrants in 1887. The Chinese Exclusion Act was supposed to last for only 10 years, but it would be extended over and over again until 1943, when China and the United States became allies against a common enemy, the Japanese, during World War II. Before anti-Chinese legislation took hold, there had been violent attacks on Chinese immigrants and their communities. Usually, these attacks happened when there were tough economic times. Violence towards the Chinese raged throughout the West Coast during the late 1800s. For instance, in San Francisco in 1877, a mob burned down the city's Chinatown and beat up residents. Chinese businesses and homes were looted and destroyed, and it took days for the police, who were ineffective at putting down the mob, to try and restore some type of order. Even after the Exclusion Act, the Chinese remained targets. In 1885, during the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, white miners blamed unemployment conditions on Chinese. Like what happened in San Francisco, they burned down the local Chinatown and attacked the residents. But this time the bloodshed also resulted in the murder of at least 28 Chinese miners. While the Chinese Exclusion Act was attempting to limit the number of immigrants coming from China, state and city governments tried to segregate the Chinese in areas like public schools. The San Francisco School Board established a segregated Chinese primary school for children to attend, including those who were American-born. In 1905, the San Francisco School Board would state, "Our children should not be placed in any position where their youthful impressions may be affected by association with pupils of the Mongolian race." The school board also applied the Chinese segregation policy later to other Asian students as well. By 1885, following the Chinese Exclusion Act and the decline in numbers of Chinese laborers coming to the United States, larger numbers of young Japanese laborers, together with fewer numbers of Koreans and Indians, began to arrive on the West Coast, where they replaced the Chinese as cheap labor in building railroads, farming, and fishing industries. By the turn of the century, Japanese immigrants had settled in the wake of Chinese exclusion, but as their numbers grew in areas like California, hostility and anti-Japanese legislation followed. A treaty with Japan in 1894 had assured free immigration, but as the number of Japanese workers in California increased, they were met with growing hostility and the government was pressured for anti-Japanese immigration policies. In August of 1900, Japan agreed to deny passports to some laborers seeking to enter the United States. This, however, did not stop many workers who had obtained Japanese passports to go to areas like Canada, Mexico, or Hawaii, which at this time, remember, is not yet a U.S. territory, and then move from those areas into the United States. Racial antagonism intensified, which was fueled by inflammatory articles in the press and cartoons. Smaller numbers of Korean immigrants came to Hawaii and then the mainland United States following the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War and Japan's occupation of Korea. Serving as strikebreakers, railroad builders, and agricultural workers, Korean immigrants faced not only racist exclusion in the United States, but Japanese colonization at home. Some Korean patriots had also settled in the United States as political exiles and organized for Korean independence. On May 7, 1905, a Japanese and Korean Exclusion League was organized in California. The league was established on a platform of 4 principles. First, extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act to include Japanese and Koreans. Second, exclusion by league members of Japanese employees and the hiring of firms that employ the Japanese. Third, initiating and pressuring the school board to segregate Japanese school children from white school children. And fourth, initiation of a propaganda campaign to inform Congress and the President of this menace on the West Coast. On October 11, 1906, the San Francisco School Board arranged for all Asian children to be placed in segregated schools. San Francisco School Superintendent Aaron Altman advised the city's principals, quote, "Any child that may apply for enrollment or be present at your school who may be designated under the head of Mongolian must be excluded, and in furtherance of this, please direct them to apply at the Chinese school for enrollment." Japan had been trying to limit its immigration to the United States since 1900. However, hostility towards the Japanese on the West Coast had continued to grow. Japan was deeply wounded by San Francisco's discriminatory law that they viewed as aimed at its people. At the time San Francisco passed the law, there were only 92 Japanese students that were spread out across 23 different elementary schools in the city. Segregation policies for Japanese students had existed in the city for decades, but they were not enforced because there were not that many Japanese students and there were not any formal complaints to the school board. Japanese families lived dispersed throughout the city and not in a centralized area like Chinatown, so it was harder to build a school in an area of the city dedicated solely for them that would be accessible to all of them. Also, there was less resentment towards Japanese students who had lived and grown up in white neighborhoods, and there was room for the students in white schools. The Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, however, began to launch formal complaints to the school board that at first were voted down due to lack of resources to build a school for only 92 Japanese students. However, when San Francisco experienced a massive earthquake in 1906 and a fire that followed, many of the city's schools were damaged, and it became necessary to close some school and send the white students to the ones that were not damaged. As they did so, there became less and less room for the Japanese students, who were eventually ordered to attend the Oriental School in Chinatown. The fire and earthquake also massively damaged the public transportation system in San Francisco, which made it incredibly difficult for Japanese students to get to their new school in Chinatown. President Roosevelt wanted to preserve good relations with Japan as a way to counter Russian expansion in the Far East, and he eventually intervened. While the American ambassador reassured the Japanese government that the issue would be handled, President Roosevelt summoned the San Francisco mayor and the San Francisco School Board to the White House in February of 1907, and he persuaded them to rescind the segregation order, promising that the federal government would handle the immigration issue. On February 24th, the gentleman's agreement with Japan was concluded in the form of a note from Japan sent to America. Japan agreed to deny passports to laborers intending to enter the United States, and recognizing the United States' right to exclude Japanese immigrants who held passports originally issued from neighboring countries from entering our country. This was aimed at trying to stop the flow of Japanese immigrants who would first go to Canada, Mexico, and Hawaii, and then travel from there through into the United States. The United States, as part of the agreement, also agreed to repeal the San Francisco School Board order, which it did do. South Asian Indian immigrants also entered the United States as laborers following Chinese exclusion. Recruited initially by the Canadian Pacific Railroad companies, a few thousand Sikh immigrants from the Punjabi region immigrated to Canada, which at this time, like India, was part of the British Empire. Later, many migrated into the Pacific Northwest and California and became farm laborers or worked in other industries. Exclusionists and white labor leaders referred to the wave of immigration as the tide of the turbans, and it was called a Hindu invasion in others. Similar to other Asian immigrant groups, violence followed nativist ideology, and in Bellingham, Washington, Sikhs were the victims of violence, as you can see here in this short clip. The nativist push to stop Indian immigration, and pretty much all Asian immigration as a whole, was successful in 1917 when Congress expanded the ban on Asian immigrants and declared that India was part of the Pacific Barred Zone of excluded Asian countries. The zone pretty much barred almost all of Asian immigration to the United States. Angel Island sits in the San Francisco Bay and opened in 1910. Like Ellis Island in New York, Angel Island here in San Francisco was used as an immigration processing center for mostly Asian immigrants. Here you can see the administration building on Angel Island. The Asian immigrants that were processed at Angel Island had to go through many of the same procedures as the European immigrants did at Ellis Island, but their experience here was also incredibly different. The immigrants at Angel Island were given a medical examination to ensure that they were not entering the country with a contagious disease. The examination was not a 6-second physical like European immigrants received. Men were separated from women and children, then proceeded for medical exams, which was a much more humiliating experience for Asians, whose traditional medical practice does not include disrobing before strangers or being measured by things like metal calipers. Here they would also be tested for parasitic infections. Consequences could be severe for failing this test, including hospitalization at their own expense or deportation. While immigrants at Ellis Island were usually processed within hours, at Angel Island immigrants were detained for days, months, and in some extreme cases, even years. After the examinations, they were assigned a detention dormitory and a bunk, where they would await their interrogators, who would be the Board of Special Inquiry. Circumventing the Chinese Exclusion Act became a first-order concern for most immigrants from China, as it allowed for only merchants, clergy, diplomats, and teachers and students to come as exempt classes here. Many Chinese immigrants resorted to buying false identities at great cost to get around the Chinese Exclusion Act. This allowed them to immigrate as either children of exempt classes or children of natives. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and fire destroyed municipal records, which created an opportunity for the city's Chinese residents to claim that they were American-born and therefore were American citizens. As citizens, Chinese could now bring their children to this country and on return visits to their ancestral villages claim new children had been born to them. Some of these immigrants coming back to the United States were what we call quote-unquote paper sons or less frequently paper daughters. They were children on paper only without a direct family connection. To learn more about paper sons or daughters, watch the video clip here.
Erica G. grew up like any other Los Angeles kid, playing with Barbie and clutching on to Pooh Bear for dear life. But she was different. Her grandfather was not who he said he was. He'd come to the United States from China illegally as a paper son, paying about $1,800 to attach himself to another family.
So I found out in high school. I was pretty surprised, and the legacy is that, in some ways, our family came in illegally, and I was wondering, are we going to get deported?
Now 35 years old, Erica G. is with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, an organization that has researched paper sons.
Who are these people? They don't have the same last name as us. How could they be related to us?
One scholar estimates 150,000 paper sons and daughters committed this crime to navigate around the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
We have to remember the times. It was during the Chinese Exclusion Act, and at that time, and still is to today, the only law in the U.S. immigration history books that specifically excluded a specific group of people, and those were Chinese laborers.
125 years ago this month, the Chinese Exclusion Act was approved by Congress. It stated that in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities.
The fear among the Californians and those especially in the Bay Area of all these Chinese wanting to take over their jobs. These are all people that were willing to work, that helped to build the railroads, and yet when the railroads were completed, all of a sudden there's this hysteria about the Chinese invading.
For 61 years, until 1943, it was illegal for Chinese who were not among the elite to enter the United States. David Leong was a paper son. He was 8 in 1940, the year he came through Angel Island Immigration Station, the main gateway for Chinese immigrants. While on the boat for 20 days, he memorized his coaching papers, grand cheat sheets that outlined who your fake parents and siblings were and who lived on certain blocks of your would-be family village in China. Young David had to convince his Angel Island interrogators he was the son of a Mr. Chan and not a Mr. Leong.
So this is the interrogation room. This is where you walked in after 3 weeks. And what do you remember of this?
I think it was me, interpreter, and interrogator, and I think 2 people in a panel.
Leong passed the interrogation, and that's why today he was able to return with us to Angel Island Immigration Station. Today, there's only a rebuilt foundation of where the main administration building once stood. As we walked, Leong spoke about his acting ability as an 8-year-old and the life he escaped from in China.
The Japanese plane was shooting at us and missing us, but then the bullet was hitting the sand, and the sand was rising, just like you've seen in the movies.
Leong escaped a war as well as dirt floor living conditions to come to the United States. On Angel Island, he was alone, with no family, and recalls the fears he had.
At night, I wouldn't go to the bathroom at all. I heard people have committed suicide in there because they couldn't get off the island.
The fear Leong shares is what litters the walls of the Angel Island barracks, poems of melancholy retrospectives of life in China, or simple hopes of freedom. Daniel Kwan is an architect specializing in museums and has been researching the history of Angel Island for 13 years.
The frustration that was felt by many of the detainees was then written on the walls as a statement, or sort of silent statement. And so for them, the feeling was this was a prison because they were just being held against their will. And for a lot of people, they'd heard about the immigration process in China, but to actually have experienced it and lived in the wooden building, as they called it, was something very different for them because they weren't used to being held against their will.
Under reconstruction now, the barracks here at Angel Island Immigration Station held some 300 detainees at a time. The purpose was to keep them here from 2 weeks to 2 years as they were interrogated. They were trying to keep out illegal immigrants, potential paper sons, and potential paper daughters.
Today, no one can enter inside the buildings of Immigration Station. The walls are falling, halls dangerous with holes in the floor, and the paint a mosaic of dilapidation. Still, many visitors come to the island to learn about their own past.
Often we've met people that come over here and they learn about their parents' past through research to the National Archives or through meeting people that have worked with the Immigration Station project and didn't even know about it through their own family.
And that is because many paper sons and daughters still feel embarrassment or even fear of being deported to this day. Which takes us back to Erica G. She was lucky enough to hear from her own grandfather, who broke his silence and told her real family name was Chin. But some questions remain.
Are you glad that your grandfather committed the crime?
You know, in some ways, no, because it was a crime. But at the same time, you know, I'm really fortunate that he did. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for the risk that he took in order to come over to the United States and to provide a better opportunity for his family.
And when asked about immigrants trying to do what her grandfather did a century ago, she wavers.
I don't know. I don't know if I feel comfortable saying, you know, it's okay for people to come in. So,
It's perplexing for you, isn't it?
yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of Chinese Americans face a similar dilemma. Researchers suggest that 1 in 3 Chinese Americans are survivors or descendants of the paper son system. That's about 1 million people. And many only learn of their background as a loved one takes their paper secret to their grave, which was the case for Erica's cousins.
Some of my cousins are a little confused because they don't read Chinese, but then they know our character, G, and then they're like, well, where is it on the tombstone?
Erica still visits her grandfather's gravesite to pay her respects to a tombstone that has not 1 but 2 names engraved, his paper son name in English and his real name in Chinese. Richard Louie, CNN, Oakland, California.
To try and counter the paper sons and daughters that were coming through Angel Island, immigration inspectors developed grueling interrogations. The immigrant would be called before a board of special inquiry composed of 2 immigrant inspectors, a stenographer, and a translator when needed. Over the course of several hours, or in some cases even days, the applicant would be asked about minute details about their family history, the location of their village, and even their homes. In the case of paper sons and daughters, these questions had been anticipated, and thus, irrespective of the true nature of the relationship to their sponsor, the immigrant had been prepared for months in advance by committing these details to memory. Their witnesses, or other family members who had lived in the United States, would oftentimes be called to corroborate these answers. Any deviation from the testimony would prolong questioning or throw the entire case into doubt and put the applicant at risk of deportation, and possibly everyone else in the family connected to the applicant at risk of deportation as well. These details had to be remembered for life. Because of return trips to China, the risk of random irrigation raids, and identity card checks on the street, a paper son often had to keep these details alive throughout their entire life. Angel Island was just as much a detainment center as it was an immigration processing center. Because so many immigrants were detained on Angel Island for long periods of time, the island had barracks for housing immigrants. In some of the barracks, you can see how these detained Asian immigrants passed the time. Poems were carved on the walls in some of the barracks on Angel Island. There are over 100 poems on the island that were discovered back in 1970 when some of the barracks were going to be torn down. The poems often portrayed a range of emotions like hope in starting a new life in America, anger for being detained by the United States, and in some cases questioning their decision to leave China in the first place. Here are some examples of some of the poems, and while I click through them, I will just pause from talking for a sec. Now recognized as a historic landmark, the Angel Island Detention Center bears witness to the bitterness and frustration of excluded Chinese immigrants. The experience of Chinese immigrants on the island is the same experience that other immigrant groups from Asia, like the Japanese, Koreans, and Indian immigrants previously mentioned, would experience who were also processed here at Angel Island. While there are many parallels between European and Asian immigration during the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of the push-pull factors, the rise of anti-Asian organizations, legislation, and violence towards Asian groups would make the Asian experience in America a very different one. And while their immigration experiences did drastically vary, it is also important to remember that today, oftentimes America is referred to as a melting pot, a place where immigrants from around the world have come together and brought their cultures and beliefs to form an American nation. While Americans had different views as to if this was a beneficial thing for the country during the time period, the waves of Asian and European immigration during the turn of the 20th century is why we are that melting pot of cultures today.